Hello, everyone. I am Melissa Forziat. I'm a keynote speaker and the host of this Halt and Catch Fire rewatch podcast. Now, when I speak, my topic is something that I call Take the Doughnut, which for me is another way to say carpe diem. It's about going after the things that you want in life. Something that I wanted to do this year was to rewatch the show Halt and Catch Fire, but this time talk about it with other humans, which is a total novelty for me. So it started off with doing episode recaps. Then I began doing interviews with cast and crew from the show. And then I thought it would be really interesting to get some special bonus subject matter related interviews to help broaden our context of understanding the show and also help some new people to discover the show. So if you are brand new to the show Halt and Catch Fire, this is safe for you. This is going to be a relatively spoiler-free conversation. Hopefully it'll get you excited about the show. If you are aware of the show, but not as familiar with the venture capital world, today we're going to talk about venture capital and investing in the context of the show Halt and Catch Fire. So we have a lot of things we want to accomplish with this today. And to help me get there, I'm very happy to introduce this wonderful panel that we have, including Eric Bahn, who's the general partner and co-founder at Hustle Fund. We've got McKeever Conwell, the founder and managing partner at Rare Breed Ventures, and Goldin Martinez, venture capitalist, social entrepreneur, and founder of Goldin Brands. Welcome, everybody. So
Glad
good
to
to have you here.
Thank you, Melissa. We're
So
honored
happy
to
to
be
be
here.
here.
So before we get into anything about the show, I'd love to hear a little bit about your respective journeys in the world of venture capital and your, in your current role or maybe on the way to get there. So let's start with Eric. We can go in the order that I introduced you.
Yeah, so I've been working in Silicon Valley for the past 24 years. Born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, came out here for college and then stayed here ever since. And what I really loved about the show, and hopefully this is as much of a spoiler, is that these characters actually began in pretty non-obvious places, like Texas, actually, Silicon Prairie. And found their way to Silicon Valley as well. I kind of found a little bit of empathy in that journey as well. So after 15 years in building companies, I started Hustle Fund in 2017 to focus on supporting early stage startups, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
It's great to hear. Thank you for that background. Mac, let's get some of yours.
Yeah, so I'm a guy from Baltimore. Been here my whole life. Went to a small HBCU. Was a college dropout, so I was meant for greatness. Started out my first job working for the NSA as a software engineer. Went on to be a government contractor working with the DoD for a few years before starting my first company. Had been started the startup journey. So they had two companies, one exit, one failure, learned everything the hard way, went from like not knowing what a startup or VC was to having this journey. And then after my second company fails, I just go back into the regular workforce, right? I end up getting a job at a marketing firm. I'm running like a tech department, doing coding again. And I have this like incredible experience where something happened that I didn't agree with ethically at my job. We got a client I didn't agree with ethically, so I quit on principle, have no plan. Everybody's like, what are you doing? Like, we know you're crazy. You did the startup thing and quit your jobs and lost all your money. And like, now you're doing this again without anything going for you. And I was like, I just couldn't do it. And like that was on a Friday, and the very next Monday, the investment arm of the state of Maryland saying they were the early stage investment arm of the state of Maryland saying they were hiring a new fund manager. And I said, oh yeah, I could do that. And I applied to this job from an email, which anybody who's ever gotten a job in VC is like probably like looking like sideways, like that's not how this works. But I applied to the email, they interview me, they tell me I'm not qualified for the position, and then they literally create a junior position to bring me on staff because I was the first person of color they had ever had on their investment team in the 20-year history. And that starts my path in the venture. I spent 4 years with the state of Maryland, and then in 2020, I decided to raise my own fund, focusing on early stage, very similar to Eric. And my claim to fame is I raised my first fund mainly off of Twitter. So I was one of the VCs who was raising his money in public using a new regulation And it was a very interesting and wild journey, to be said. Anyway.
What a background. Thank you for sharing that. And that'll help us understand a bit more about how you're responding to some of the questions that I ask as well. Goldin, share a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. First of all, I just want to say, man, Eric and Mac are such cool dudes. I'm just honored to be on the same panel as them. And Eric, I got excited when you said Detroit, Michigan, because my favorite author, Mitch Albom, is a rock star in Detroit. So yeah, the man changed my life with his books. But yeah, Melissa, so I'm honored to be here. My path to VC was very non-traditional. I started off as a social entrepreneur at 19 years old. My first year of business school, my professor challenged me to create a business plan. And once I created the business plan, he then challenged me to execute the business plan. And my idea was to create a social organization called Get Focused to empower young people from my community to read and exercise. These were two things that I was doing in my life at that point that really helped me be successful. And I felt that if I can spread that message to young people, I can also help ensure that they're successful in life. So I started the program, again, my first year of college, and it quickly grew from one teenager to over 150 teenagers in a matter of 3 months. And I guess in today's age, we would say it went viral. And kids were asking to be a part of the Get Focused program left and right. And that's when it forced me to become what we call a startup founder, right? And figure out how to start gathering resources and building your ecosystem and building infrastructure. And I just dived into becoming an executive director of this organization. And in a matter of a year, we were running a full-fledged program. And then we got interviewed by the Good Morning America team. And they told our story on how we started this from the ground up. And we began producing a curriculum for other nonprofits who wanted to do the same thing. And it became a business. And 3 years later, we were a citywide organization. And that was my experience as a social entrepreneur. And then I began getting invited to other teams who wanted to incorporate social entrepreneurship into the team. That led me to joining the coffee team in New York. We were a small coffee chain. When I joined them, they had about 2 locations, but they wanted to become the next Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, et cetera, et cetera. But the difference was they wanted to be the most charity-minded, altruistic coffee shop in New York City. So every single location had a 10% of profits donated back into the communities that we were serving. Using that model, we were able to scale to over 24 locations in 3 years. And reason it was so successful was because developers who wanted to partner with socially responsible brands, they wanted to invite us into their ecosystem. And that led me to, we sold the company in 2018, and that's when I became an investor. And I began investing into the public markets, into real estate. I had no idea about venture capital until about 2020, when I discovered Jeff Ransdell, the founder and general partner at Fuel Venture Capital. And he took me under his wing, mentored me, and said, "You ever thought about VC?" And I said, "No, I never thought about it." He's like, "Man, you would be a rock star, man, because you understand from a founder perspective and you understand from an investor perspective. I think you should really consider." And yeah, I took his advice, went back to school. I enrolled into Columbia Business School. They had a venture capital program, the inaugural one, and I was a part of that cohort, graduated, and joined Fuel Venture Capital as a GP, and I've been there ever since. So
this is great to hear. So between the three of you, we have so many different views into this area, and also how we would potentially view the show. Now, we've all introduced ourselves. Let me introduce the show for those who aren't familiar with it, to start putting some context to the questions that I'll ask today. So for some background, Halt and Catch Fire, it's a television show. It ran from 2014 to 2017. It tells the story of a team of main characters, let's say 5 main characters, with different technical skill sets that are all on the forefront of the major technical advancements from, let's say, 1983 to 1994 in the world, in the vicinity of computers. So it starts with personal computers, We even get developments in community game and chat forums, antivirus software. We even start to move into the World Wide Web because we're getting, all the way up to 1994 in the show. So that's some of the things that we're looking at. These are people who are really at the forefront and the cutting edge of these developments. The show starts, like Eric mentioned, in the Silicon Prairie in North Texas, and then it moves to San Francisco. So I'll try to keep it as spoiler free as possible, but I thought those were some details that might be helpful for people to understand the context of what this show is about. Now, one of my favorite lines in this show, and this happens early in season 1, is from a character named John Bosworth, who's an old school Texas salesman. And he says, "Venture capital? I remember when they still called it money." So in the show, we see the growth of the computer industry. We see how critical investing was and is to those great developments that we're going to see throughout the show. As people in this industry, as people with the backgrounds that you have, what are some of the real world impacts you've witnessed as a result of investing? And maybe we'll start with Eric again.
I think this answer can go a couple of ways depending on who's going to be responding to this after me, but it can either go really great or really poorly. So I've actually seen both sides of this. As a founder, I've taken a lot of venture money earlier in my career, and I'd say that most of it wasn't that great in the form of, the money was fine, but then the social contract that you enter with the VC, at least in my case, wasn't all that positive. A lot of ghosting, a lot of really negative behavior, some backstabbing here and there. Actually, elements of this are even shown in the show as well. So there's a negative side to this, but then there's also positive. I've also worked with VCs who will roll up their sleeves, really get their hands dirty in trying to help you to sort through the problems, are strategic in every single way in opening up their network and their knowledge and trying to train their founders. So I think as there's such a diversity of personalities out there in the world, so are all the flavors of VC. And I think what the show did really well, but something that founders are understanding even in this industry, is that it can come down to even the personalities of the people that you invite into your cap table that can completely change how the feelings, the dynamics are within your company in terms of whether it's like a positive relationship or not. But it is a relationship that's far more serious for founders, and a decision that's far more serious for founders than often is maybe realized in the very beginning. So those are some of my experiences, at least when I was a founder, feeling the venture capital dollars coming in.
Thank you for sharing that. Goldin, I'll have you respond next. So, what are some of those real world impacts that you've witnessed?
Thank you, Melissa. Eric, that was such a great answer. And I'll piggyback on some of what Eric said. In a positive scenario, you're gaining a trusted partner, right? Not only an investor. So the right venture capitalist is coming in, adding value, boots on the ground, getting their hands dirty, and helping you grow to that next level, right? In a negative situation, you may have a venture capitalist who doesn't have your best interest in mind, and who wants to eventually have a hostile takeover, which I've seen happen to many founders, and it's very unfortunate. But one real life example that I've seen, at least at Fuel, with Jeff and Maggie and my partners, is we're able to give access to founders who normally won't have access to VC, right? So that's something. I think Mac mentioned it earlier. There's a very low percentage of women who are being funded. So we prioritize women entrepreneurship, women founders. LGBTQ communities also are underrepresented in the VC space. So we're able to champion for them as well. And Black and Latinos, most importantly, right? We've been left out of these opportunities for many, many decades. And it's very nice to see VC step up now and open those doors and invite them in and give them the opportunity they deserve. There's a lot of founders in these underrepresented communities. They're just not being given an opportunity. So that's what I've been seeing And it's been a big trend, and I hope that it becomes a permanent stake in the industry.
Thank you for sharing. Oh, that's great context to have. Mac, what's your experience been with this?
So we as VCs are privy to like some of the craziest reality TV shows you could ever imagine, right? And there's a lot of positive and negatives that come with that, right? And so when you ask the question, real world, I know my colleagues are being kind in the way that we're framing it and giving real world examples, because it's not okay to talk about this kind of stuff in public. On the negative side, on the positive side, we tout it in the forms of money, but not like real world impact. We try to. So if I think on the positive and negative side, let's start with positive. I'm an investor in a company, Elite Gaming Live, was one of the first investors in that company while I'm still working for the state of Maryland, and reinvested out of my fund at Rare Breed. And it's a company that incorporates STEM education and esports. It's after school program, right? Kids learn while playing video games, really cool. I got it the first time I ever met the founder. It made sense to me. I was a video game geek growing up. I loved it. And if you told me that if I passed a math test, I could win a competition while also playing, like I'd have been all about it, right? But it became most clear to me when I went to one of their regional championships in Northern Virginia. It's like 150 students competing. It's like 350 people at this thing watching it. Kids are winning money, they're winning TVs, they're winning game systems. And in one of the age groups, there was a young man with autism who had won his age group. And his parents were so excited because their son, who didn't have friends before and felt isolated, now had a team and now had friends and now is performing better at school. And it made a material impact in that family's life. That's true positive impact from indirectly from the kind of work that we do. Let's talk about the negative side. I had a female founder who had a male investor, after making an investment, contact her and tell her that she was going to add him and an associate of his onto her board, and that if she did not, they were going to sue her company. And when she said, for what? This investor said, it doesn't matter. You can't afford a lawsuit, which means either let me on your board or I kill your company as an investor in the company. And that was a situation that me and other investors had to personally get involved in to help prevent something like that, right? But there are many situations where there's not somebody who can prevent that, because as a founder, that power dynamic is really tough, right? So we're going to give real world, let's be honest about it.
Thank you all for sharing sort of all this, maybe not all the sides, but many sides of this situation in the real world. And I think that certainly lines up with some of the things that we see in this show. We see the good and the bad come from the relationship with investing to the startup, the founder. So this show gives us the opportunity to see characters pitching to investors to get funding, in some seasons more than others. In some cases, we're looking at pre-seed or seed funding, but in other cases, the business is already established and looking to grow beyond where it is right now. Initially, we see it as a very tough, very competitive process with a lot of potential for rejection. So for, in your experience being on the other side of this, what makes for a strong pitch? I'll let anybody who wants to answer that respond.
I'll take this because it's really simple, actually. I think everybody gets focused on the pitch, right? It's like, how do I present this properly? That's not really what makes the best pitch. What makes the best pitch is the company making the most money the fastest. If you're making a ton of money fast, if your traction is fast, we are jumping all over ourselves to invest. It doesn't even matter what else you said. It doesn't matter how much, it doesn't matter all the terminology you got wrong. It doesn't matter how well you don't understand your operations. We may be having heart palpitations as we realize you don't know any of this stuff. But we are still going to be falling all over ourselves to give you money. And we're going to be thinking to ourselves, oh, we can find a grown up to help them, right? We can find somebody to go in and help them. But if you're making money, that's what we care about. Like all the other stuff, like, yes, you can make us more interested through the story, through the pitch. But like at the end of the day, it's a money game. For founders who want to be the strongest and most effective in raising capital, have the strongest and most effective business. And the money will find you.
I have a slightly different take than this. I think we're all aligned that this entire endeavor of venture capital, what founders are doing, ultimately should have some sort of outcome that makes everyone a lot of wealth. But what I think a lot of TV shows miss when it comes to the pitch is they usually just present, I'm in front of this VC or this investor, and I'm actually going to go through the pitch. But it's all the stuff that happens before that, right? It's the relationship building. It's a lot of the warm introductions that are made, the trust building and credibility. I'd say that is probably the most necessary part of at least even having a chance to pitch, are the circumstances of how you develop those relationships over time. And sometimes they're done over years. I'm also, just like my colleagues here, constantly raising capital for my own fund. And some of these people that I've been developing haven't said yes to me in the last 7 years, but I still, provide them updates. I have lots of other references that allows me to keep in touch with them or put me in front of them as well. So I think that's also another aspect here of the reality that's quite different from what's seen on TV, not just with Halt and Catch Fire, but a lot of shows. It's not just the pitch is like the last part almost. It's all the stuff that leads up to allowing you to even pitch.
Eric, I got a question though, right? So this brings up something that we talk about in our industry a lot around this idea of warm intros.
Mm-hmm.
You just laid out a story of, in order for somebody to pitch to an investor, you have to build the proper relationships or be in the right circles to even get to the point to pitch to them, whether you have a good company or not. Why do you think that is? And where do you fall on that in the industry?
I think my perspective is that I shared is probably more the traditional perspective that it's only necessary to have warm introductions in order to get the meeting. I know that for certainly your fund, Mac, and mine at Hustle Fund, we do take people cold because we share, I think, a common belief, which is if you're going to make a lot of money in business, you have to be both contrarian and right. And a lot of founders don't begin with network, right? They're building in whatever circumstances they are. They could be from Detroit, they could be from Baltimore, not from Silicon Valley. And, we can hopefully take chances on those kinds of founders because, that's how we structured our funds. And maybe Goldin, you're the same for your fund as well. But I will say this is the prevailing belief in venture, right? Which is just like, you're not credible unless you have a warm introduction. I'm not saying that we necessarily represent that views, but I think the majority of our industry does. In addition to that, too, this actually does tie to the show a little bit. There is a not prevailing, but a common belief, let's say, within our industry that you're not serious unless you live in San Francisco, building in San Francisco, right? And I wholesale reject that, Mac. I know for a fact that you do. Goldin, I'm going to proffer that you do as well, since you're building a great fund out of New York. And but that's something that is felt, and it's actually a little bit reflected in the show too when they decide to move from Silicon Prairie over to Silicon Valley in at least the show, simply because it's probably partly driven by that reason, which is like the most serious people are in Silicon Valley. So maybe that's something that is more of a newer arc in the last decade of VCs like ours starting to have different kinds of theses around warm introductions or where you're based, taking cold introductions as well. But I think my earlier comments were more around the old school prevailing beliefs.
Goldin, I saw that you unmuted. Did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Sure. Man, what an interesting conversation we're having right now. So to echo on Eric and Mac's point, warm introductions are important, but just like Eric mentioned, deal flow can come from anywhere. right? So we're constantly looking for all kind of deals. But most importantly, when you're thinking about pitching or crafting your pitch to an investor, it's about, for me at least, it's the market opportunity, right? And it's about the future of the world, right? So what comes to mind is a gentleman named Jake Paul and his partner Joey Levy, who started a company called Better, which is one of the companies that we're the lead investors in. And they're betting that in the live betting industry, we're gonna see an increase in micro betting, right? So micro betting, it's a whole new trend in the betting world. It's something that's literally growing every single day by leaps and bounds. And they're positioning their company Better as the leader when it comes to micro betting and also media and content. Joey Levy's a genius when it comes to that. He's signing deals with influencers and celebrities and helping them produce podcasts and helping them produce content that all ties back into Better, right? And to me, we want to find those kind of founders who can see the future, right? Right now, we're talking about AI. We're talking about women's sports. Women's sports is growing tremendously, right? So any company in a position to cater to that industry, we want to hear about them, whether in whatever space, whether it's in delivering health and wellness services to the women's sports industry, whether it's delivering apparel to the women's sports industry. But so you have to see the future, and we want to meet founders who can see that, because that's really where you can win big, in my opinion.
Well said. So actually, when we're talking about founders, in this show, pitches are most often made by founding partners. And sometimes those relationships are dicier than others. So I'm curious for you, in terms of your experience, how does it change the process when you're dealing with, let's say, one founder versus a partnership?
Oh yeah, I can jump if you guys don't mind. Yeah, when we call them solopreneurs, right? When there's just one founder coming in pitching, it's less of a risk for us, because then there's this high chance that if you have a bunch of partners, when money starts being injected into your business, there's a lot of who owns what, who does what, and sometimes that becomes really challenging to us as investors, right? So what we ask, even in the due diligence phase, we want to see the cap table. We want to understand who owns what, how's the equity being split. That way, we know that everyone's happy, right? And that there's a high morale at the company. But if there's poor morale at the company in the beginning between the partners, it's very scary for us as investors. So ideally, yeah, a solopreneur is always ideal, but also it's scary because then their capacity is not big enough sometimes, right? So sometimes you need several partners. You need someone who focuses on technology, someone who focuses on operation. So that's very attractive as well. But most importantly, you need to understand the morale of that team. So very, very important to know that, in my opinion.
I think as early stage investors, the most important criteria that you're investing into a company is actually the team itself. So in the early days, when there's no product market fit, things are getting going, it's just a bet on the team. Later on, let's say you're a growth stage investor and it's years later and the team's got traction, maybe it's a little more of a mathematical exercise of just the fundamentals of business are good. So because they're betting on the people, the co-founder relationship is utterly critical, as Goldin has cited. And I'll say this, I've been a solo founder before for 9 years, and I've had co-founders before. I had one bad co-founder, and I've had some great co-founders too. And the co-founder relationship is amazing. It actually supersedes just business partnership or even friendship. It's almost closer to being like a brother or sister to that person. And it's remarkable because if you have family, you can love someone as your sibling and absolutely hate working with them or hate them in like other kind of contexts as well. And so for us, like at Hustle Fund, when we're investing in a team, just like Goldin mentioned, like we need to make sure that the dynamics between the two are not just complementary, but emotionally complementary as well. So professionally as well as just emotionally. And that's one of the trickiest things, because at the early stages, it's really easy for companies to fall apart, even if they're working really well on all of other fronts, simply based on the egos or the emotions too. And I think that plays out a little bit in the show that we're talking about here. But it's kind of one of those things where it feels so love-hate at times. And again, I think the show did a really good job of demonstrating that. Not to spoil anything.
Mac, I think you're on. Yep, there you go.
Yeah. For me, when I think about it, my biases come from being an early stage investor, like Eric said. So at this stage, we tend to prioritize teams because it's just so much work you have to do that's almost impossible to do as one person, right? That doesn't mean if you're a solopreneur, if you're one founder, that you can't build a team around you who aren't co-founders, or you can't find a way to execute until you find them later, right? Like this is all an exercise, and when you meet an investor, we're trying to see how much you've executed. And if you can demonstrate that you can, then the way your team is constructed may not matter as much. There are investors who will tell you they only invest in teams, they will not invest in solo founders because it is so much you have to get done, right? On the flip side, we also know that founder breakup is one of the most common reasons companies fall apart. We also realize that founding teams almost never last throughout the life cycle of a company. It's very rare to see the founding team be the team that's there when they get to an IPO. That's very, very rare, right? But what I look for is at the early stage, do you have a team, or if you're by yourself, do you have the ability to execute? If you're by yourself, that's easy for me to surmise by your traction. You've been able to build this business, it's working, you're growing. It doesn't matter that you're by yourself, right? You figured out how to get this thing humming. If you have a team, now I really want to understand how well do you work together, right? And that can come in subtle ways, like when I'm having a meeting with you, watching teammates talk over each other. Or if I ask a question, do the teammates have different answers? They're not on the same page type of thing. And also understanding, like, hey, we got 2 CEOs. That's great. So if you have a decision, who's the final yes on a major decision? I need to know that there's a person to have a final yes. And you can have your company set up and say, hey, our CTOs are responsible for final yes on texting. Our COO oversees, the team, and CEO oversees product. And like, okay, but I need to know who has the final say, because that decision by committee makes it really tough to get things done in a world where you have to move lightning quick to keep up with your competition in your industry. And so when looking at a team, we need to understand that when you're individual, I know who the final say is, but now do I know that you have enough manpower around you to do all the work you need to do? So it's give and take either way.
This is so interesting. Thank you for shedding light on this. And I didn't realize how many viewpoints there could be and how many ways in there could be with some of these questions. This is adding a lot of information for me. So a really important factor in this show is the presence of female founders and investors. This show being set in the 80s and 90s gives us a sense that it was challenging to be a woman on either side of this process at that time. I'm curious, to tell us more about the landscape and how it looks now for female founders or female investors, whatever you feel more comfortable to respond to there. And, how much evolution have you seen with that during your careers? I'll leave that one open for whoever wants to jump in.
I can attempt. So first, I'm going to caveat saying I'm not a woman, and I can't speak the truth fully to the female experience of being a founder or a VC. I can only relay what I've been shared by some of my colleagues. I do work with 2 women at Hustle Fund. We're actually one of the few female-led funds. Only 5% of US VC funds are actually led by women, and we're one of them. And also my wife is a founder too. So I think I can summarize it in one word. It's still, I guess, shitty, right? I mean, it was bad back then, and it's not great today, but I think slightly better. And here's kind of what I've learned. Obviously, the 80s were a very different time in terms of just like the environment was, I'm going to just say less evolved, right? Like women just had even, I think, less clout when it came to society or the business world and so forth. And also, I think the other dynamic in the 80s, let's say, was that there are far fewer VC funds. So if you were one of the general partners of a VC fund back then, and there was less than 100 that actually mattered, maybe less than 50 that mattered back then, you could be a total jerk. You could be sexist, you could be harassing, and there are almost no consequences because you're one of the few gatekeepers to success for the founders. And it didn't make any sense for a founder back then, and there were fewer tools to actually complain anonymously. There's just no incentive for like female founders back then to complain because they didn't want to disrupt the boys club that they needed to be a part of in order to get their funding. Fast forward to today. There are actually a lot more venture capitalists, funds like the three that are being represented here are good examples of more emerging manager types with a very different kind of attitude. And we grew up in a really different kind of worldview as well, in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. So I think the attitude towards supporting women is probably better. And also there are more female VCs, even though I just complained that there are still far too few, and that's truly the case. In addition to that, too, I think there's a little bit more accountability. You have anonymous tools, you have Twitter, you have other kinds of social forums as well, where people can safely talk about their experiences with venture capitalists. But that said, it's still always hard. Like there's a lot of bias, I think, towards female founders. I'll give you an example of this. When we were first raising our first fund, my co-founder Elizabeth was pregnant. I remember several occasions where an LP, an investor in a fund, said, like, how are you going to manage this fund while being a mom? And my response, I jump in, was like, why aren't you asking me that question? I just had a baby 3 months ago, right? Like, why is that a question for her? What, like, you should be asking me, right? Piss me off every time, but still happens, right? So shitty back then, probably still shitty now, a little bit less shitty. Simply because I think there's more female VCs, but also just as more women are entering this industry on the founder end of it too. I think they're doing a great job amongst the women, but also with allies too, to lift each other up. And there's still a path there's a wider and wider path to carve, where I think that women can be really successful in this industry. And I think actually the end solution to all this is that if someday 50% of VCs are women on the general partner side, I think a lot of this gets solved, right? But we're really far away from that, and we need more female billionaires in the process that we can hopefully support, the three of us guys, and convince them to jump on this side of the table once they've gained their wealth and have their clout, and can really leverage that to a more equitable industry as well.
Yeah, you're thank you for that, Eric. Wow. That was perfect, because you're 100% right. A female's pitch deck would be literally under a microscope in comparison to a male's pitch deck. So the moment an investor would see that it was a male founder, they're like, okay, right, it's not really under this microscope. But the moment they see it's a female founder, like to Eric's point, like they're asking these crazy questions to almost put all these obstacles and hurdles in front of them to basically give them a rejection and give them a no. And again, to leave them out of the opportunity and of the access. But again, to Eric's point, there are some women stepping up into charge, right? We're watching Serena Williams stepping up. We're watching Alicia Keys stepping up. There's a lot of even men who just strictly are launching funds strictly just for women entrepreneurship. My friend Kelly Kimball and Marquessa Finch, they have their fund that's strictly just for women entrepreneurship. So what my perspective is, I believe that we should have more women involved in the space. We should try to find talent early, right? I think that there's not enough being said about the venture capital industry in high schools and even in college. So I think that if we can figure out a way to bring the education to the masses and democratize the industry a bit, then that'll give more opportunity for females to enter. Yeah, that's my perspective.
I think so for me, this question is very palpable because as Eric knows very well, the reason I started my fund is because of a female founder, right? But like, just to start off with your question, what's changed? Very little. There are more women in VC and there are more venture funds, right? There are more female founders. There are more female founders who have gotten funded for building a path. Do they still deal with sexism? Yes. Do they still deal with dirty old men, dirty young men? Yes. Right? Do they deal with every time they go into a networking event? Every man in the room is probably going to view them as a woman first and the founder second. While at this networking event, they're going to view every other male they see as another founder, right? Or CEO first, right? It's a different dynamic. It's there, it exists. And there are people who are working to change it. But when we talk about changing it, how do you get more female founders getting funded? Well, we know when there are more female investors and people who look like you're a better chance to get funded, right? Well, then on the same side, who do those female VCs go to raise capital from, right? That's where it gets a lot more opaque, right? When you talk about LP bases, now we're talking about high ultra net worth individuals, and then we're talking large institutions. Those are very small, that's a very small pool of groups of places you can go to get funding, where, again, you don't know who those folks are, and they don't care if you know, they don't care what you have to say because they're the ones with the money, right? And so when I think about it, it's the whole chain, right? You need more women LPs, more women GPs, more women founders, right? It all flows. But just for me, the reason I started my venture fund isn't because I wanted to start a fund. I wanted to get a job working at a big name fund, making a bunch of money. I have foregone financial success earlier in my career to start a venture fund because I never wanted to find the female founder I believed in tell me the only way she could raise money to build a prototype was by becoming a surrogate mother. Right? I watched the founder go 3 years of doing everything she could to meet everybody she could to try and figure out how to break into these networks and learn all these things, and got so frustrated that she just needed to do it. And so she had somebody else's baby and put her health at serious risk as a Black woman in America, where her risk is even higher for her, just so she could get a nominal amount of money to start the process and still have a giant bill to not even finish a prototype. That is literally why I decided I was going to start a fund, because I couldn't think of another fund that would make an investment in her at that time. And I thought that was criminal. Right? And so how much has changed? There are things that are better. We're working towards progress, but the pace at which we move at, we seem to be comfortable with, and that's the disappointment.
Thank you all for sharing the insight on that. I know as we were sort of wrapping up on time, but I do have another question related to the show itself before we sort of close out with a final question. So there's, in this show, we're going to see a lot of drama around an IPO process and the decision whether or not to do it as well. It's presented as very risky. It's presented as timing has a lot to do with what that process looks like. So I'm curious from your perspectives, how risky is this process in the real world? And, what are some of the biggest success stories you've seen?
I can try to start first on this one. So we've had one company IPO in our portfolio. And I will say that it looks painful. It costs a ton of money. And, it's interesting because a lot of people view the IPO as the end outcome. The founder gets an IPO, everyone gets wealthy, and we're done, right? But the reality is that, you're not done at all. You still have a job to do. And it's actually a much harder job at this point. Now you have to do shareholder reporting, a series of audits that's super painful. Your company is going to be under so much more public spotlight, and the guts of your business are now finally publicly exposed too. So while IPOs are really celebrated as this outcome where a bunch of people make money, and that's partly true, the reality is that the business will have to continue. And it may be something that's not really spotlighted in television because it's kind of boring, is that a lot of times also the investors and the founders themselves are locked up. The IPO happens, and then you're not allowed to sell anything for 6 months, maybe a year, more typically like 6 months. So the performance of the business has to look good for at least 2 quarters, because by the time you sell and try to cash out your money, it can actually be very different. And we see this a lot. So timing does matter, because if you're going to be doing this in a frothy environment, let's say that stocks are finding a really good momentum, people are willing to take a lot of risks, interest rates are going down, that seems to be a better environment to IPO versus the other side of it, which is like we're about to hit a recession, interest rates are going up, fear is starting to hit the market. That obviously can have some impact in terms of the performance of the stock too. But none of us have a crystal ball. Things can look good today, 3 months later can look horrific. There's exogenous effects like wars or politics, things that we can't predict at all. So it's highly risky, I would say. But I do want to just reiterate that fact, which is just the work still continues. It's not like you just wrap up, go to an island, sit on the beach for 6 months. It actually gets harder, I'd argue.
I'm glad Eric mentioned that. It's actually not many people know that once you IPO, you don't just cash out immediately. It's not instant. There's a big window of time, like Eric mentioned, that you need to be able to carry that company through that initial phase. And market conditions can be so unpredictable that you can end up taking a loss, right? And it's very scary. And again, to Eric's point, my partner, he had that harsh reality. A lot of us want to get to that finish line, and we want to get that company to the IPO, and we think it's the finish line. And then you realize it's not the finish line, and there's so much more work in front of you. And he shares that now with all of us as young VCs, like, hey, I know IPOing is it's like a badge of honor, but it's also something that is scary. And Eric, I have a question. Would you prefer an IPO for one of your portfolio companies or an acquisition? Yeah.
Whatever the founder prefers, of course, is the desired outcome. But
Yeah.
I will say that acquisitions are a little bit cleaner depending on the terms. If it's like an all cash whatever, then obviously that's easy for me to understand. There's money that hits my bank account, we're done. But it really depends on the business and what the founder prefers. And our job, I think, is just support them in whatever outcome they want to see for their shareholders too.
Love that. Thank you.
I think it's interesting that all three of us go straight to the contrarian view of the IPO. And it's risky because you also got to remember IPO is nothing but a funding round. So you're going out to raise money. So there's a chance that you spend all this money on all these consultants to go raise capital and it doesn't come through. And what we know is typically when founders are raising capital is because they're running out of capital. So that fits into the equation. So companies who are very often companies that are IPOing don't actually have a long runway of capital in the bank. That's another thing that I don't think people recognize. But I'll as well take the contrarian view of a company that is near and dear to my heart because I've gotten to know the founders, but it's a company called Millennial Media. So it's another Maryland company. And what they were is they used to be the #1 advertising platform for mobile phones, right? There's a group of guys who came out of ad.com. Ad.com is #1 for advertising on the web. They saw a mobile company, said, we'll build the mobile version of ad.com and sell it to ad and sell it back to them. That was their plan. The problem was because they became the leader in the space, they became too expensive. And so they actually couldn't find anybody who could buy them. And so then they had to IPO. And that was something the founders never actually planned for or wanted. And within 2 years of that IPO, almost all the founders had been pushed out. There was a lot of issues with their shareholders. And their company eventually got bought by ad.com for much, much, much less later, right? Because when you IPO, the regulate and like once you become a public company, you are now governed by a whole new set of regulations. Like overnight, the way you used to do things may become illegal. And you have to make sure everything signed like lines up properly. And like as founders, you get used to going to investors and kind of like presenting a very flowery story of like, oh, we're having conversations with Disney and we're talking to them about their next big movie and we're gonna, and you'd be like, oh, that's great. When you're a public company, you can't do that. Because now people are like, oh, if they get this deal with Disney, their company's gonna be more valued. So now more people are gonna be investing. That's the kind of stuff that gets people in a lot of trouble. When it's something that they used to do, that used to be just part of the game of what they did. Right. And so like that transition can be really difficult. And very often, like that's why founders aren't typically there for that. They find like professional CEOs who know how to run a public company. Because I tell you, I would never want to.
Thank you for sharing all of that. This has been such an interesting conversation. For those who want to follow any of you, where can they find you and what you're working on?
Check us out at hustlefund.vc. That's the best way to get to know our fund. And yeah, this is a really fun conversation with this amazing panel. So thank you.
You can find us at rarebreed.vc, or you can follow me on Twitter at Mac Conwell. Eric's on Twitter too, is at his name. He's easy to find.
Same here. You can find me on all platforms under my first and last name, Goldin Martinez. And to follow our companies, goldinbrands.com and fuelventurecapital.com.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that. I'll be sure to put some links in the description of the video so people can find that more easily. And, thank you so much for taking some time and talking about venture capital and investing in the context of this show, Halt and Catch Fire. And to everybody who's watching this, please go out there and watch Halt and Catch Fire. Bye, everybody.